So, unsurprisingly then, massive construction projects begin in Dublin, such as the building of the Custom House and the forecourts, and this gave Dublin a very sort of classical, almost metropolitan air. There was a desire amongst many of these gentry to improve agricultural practices, and this formed then the foundation for the formation of the Dublin Society in 1731, and in 1785 the Royal Irish Academy was founded to collect, preserve, and study ancient Irish manuscripts and antiquities. So what begins to happen then is the emergence of an image of a distinctive, a highly sophisticated Irish culture, say in opposition to a Roman or a classical culture, or a British or Scottish culture. And this then began to influence many of the Anglo-Irish elites in their campaign for greater local autonomy, which is known familiarly as patriotism. Now, while much of this scholarship was highly dubious, and maybe not conducted in the best possible circumstances, it certainly offered, in the words of the Gaelic Society, founded in 1807, an opportunity to the learned of Ireland to retrieve their character among the nations of Europe, and to show that their history and antiquities are not fitted to be consigned to eternal oblivion. So if you are operating in an environment where the classical world is the height of sophistication, what you are interested in doing is if you don't live there, is trying to find similar examples of that around where you live. Examples of a sophisticated and a cultured society. Now in the 19th century then, a significant focus for people who were interested in the Irish past was the decision of the British government to engage in a comprehensive survey of land so that they could tax everyone more efficiently. So, plus ça change. So the government then realized that it needed to produce a complete set of detailed maps of existing Irish land divisions in order to more effectively tax or rate the value of property. Now this project was carried out between 1824 and 1846 by the Ordnance Survey. The project was under the direction of Thomas Colby and Thomas Larkham, who were British Army officers. And for the first time then, the Ordnance Survey and the engineers and the soldiers who worked on this project went across the entire country and standardized all the boundaries and names for each of the roughly 60,000 townlands which formed the basic administrative unit on the island. It was also intended to publish a set of accompanying memoirs which would explain the derivation of names, where all the names had come from, to explain the local features and what they were like, and to provide other miscellaneous local information, such as whether or not there was a corn mill or what the people were like. This involved a team of Irish language scholars, including George Petrie, John O'Donovan, and Eugene O'Curry, in a considerable translation and standardization exercise. So many of the contemporary spellings of words and townland names that we have today are directly a result of the work that O'Donovan and Petrie did back here in the 1830s and 40s. Linked to this project then was called the Primary Valuation of Land, and it was conducted by the engineer and civil servant Richard Griffiths. With clear boundaries then provided by the Ordnance Survey, Griffiths was able to provide a baseline valuation of land across the entire island, and then allowing then tax to be allocated more equitably. Now for local historians though, the resources which both the Ordnance Survey and the Griffiths valuation provide are invaluable. Now for this loosely affiliated group of enthusiasts, like Petrie and O'Donovan and others, local history for them meant the links and the connections between the physical landscape, by which I mean the fields, the forests, the rivers and mountains, and the names that people had given to these places over hundreds and hundreds of years. Their interest was in the historical origins of these Irish words, where they had come from, why they had been chosen. Did the physical landscape give us an idea of why these particular names and not others? They were also interested in how they were going to translate these names into English. Now, John O'Donovan in his letters, which are actually freely available on the internet, for him, this was, quote unquote, and he says in a letter, he says, this was, working out the derivation of place names was the pleasantest study in the world, more delightful than bee hunting in America, or an Italian opera in Dublin. And it's wonderful when you read his letters, his enthusiasm for his whole project. and he had extensive correspondence with people across the island trying to work out where all of these names came from. But in the 19th century, what happens really is that political attitudes between Protestant and Catholic begin to harden. And we have the emergence then of the land war and the debate over the Union, and an interest in Ireland's ancient past, in its language and folklore, increasingly becomes the preserve of Irish nationalists. At first very much interested in Irish language and Irish culture, but over time, political nationalists as well begin to associate themselves with this kind of local study. Now again, initially, this group contains significant numbers of Protestants. Douglas Hyde, Alice Milligan, the ladies of the Glens, the Unionist ladies from the Glens of Antrim, are just some of the few. But over time, many of them left, as the issues which they had espoused, in essence the preservation and promotion of Irish language and culture, as an antidote to what they saw as British culture, this became increasingly politicized, and many of these Protestants eventually then left the cultural nationalist movement. So, what happened really was that the local history that was written in this early time was really the local history that was written up until, say, the 1950s or thereabouts. But today, local history in Ireland is written by all sorts of people from a wide range of different backgrounds, and no doubt some of you are out there in the audience tonight. Now, within the universities, local history is carried out by, obviously, professional historians, but also by geographers, anthropologists, and sociologists. Local history is, of course, still being written by amateurs, that is, members of the general public who have an interest in their own area, who may or may not be members of local history societies. A report, a survey of local history provision from 2001 indicated that the local history constituency in Ireland might be as large as 28,000 people, with approximately 300 or maybe even 500 local history societies dotted across Ireland. And you're probably, again, familiar with the two loose federations which represent many of these societies, the Federation for Ulster Local Studies and the Federation for Local History Societies, which represents those in the Republic. Now, all of this kind of activity, then, since the 1950s, there's been a number of significant developments in the way in which people who are interested in local history in Britain and Ireland have approached and written about their subject. Now, this change has prompted Kate Tiller, who is a leading practitioner of local history in England, to call it the new local history. Okay? So what I want to do now is to look at the question, what made this local history new? What made it different from the local history we've been talking about up until now? Well, the first thing is as you can see here on the slide, is the professionalization of local history, particularly in England, led by a group known as the Leicester School. Now, from about the late 1940s, a number of English historians began to focus on local history, and they were particularly interested in local communities, okay, and their life cycle. And they were led by a man called H.P.R. Finberg, and together they formed the Department for English Local Studies at the University of Leicester. Now, for Finberg, local history wasn't about places so much as it was about social entities, which is really kind of a fancy word for people. And the local historian, he said and argued, should attempt to show what he felt was the life cycle of a community. That was what a local historian should do. As he says, a local historian should try and chart the origin, growth, decline, and fall of a local community. And together, Finberg, with his colleague W.G. Hoskins, they had a strong influence on a number of young postgraduates who eventually made their way to Ireland. And individuals like Leslie Clarkson and Peter Roebuck and many others brought these ideas with them. Not only that, but the ideas in general sort of filtered across to Ireland within the historical community and became influential amongst a number of young Irish historians. Now, the second influence really on Irish local history and making it new is the influence of Eston Evans and the human geographers. Because really, Evans is really one of the most significant figures in the development of Irish local history. Now, Evans was born in Wales, And he studied human geography, so he was interested in people in places. And in 1928, he was appointed Professor of Geography at Queen's University, Belfast, and he began to do his field work on Irish field monuments. As he traveled around the country, he was struck by the continuance of what he saw as the ancient farming customs and lifestyles, and he began to advocate, through a steady stream of publications, the preservation of these regionally distinctive folkways, as he called them. He was very active in the campaign to set up the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum at Cultraw in County Down. And in one of his most influential books, The Personality of Ireland, which was published in 1973 and reissued in 1981, he argues that in order to understand the history of a particular landscape, researchers need to look at the interactions, the connections between the landscape and the people who have lived there throughout time. This means that they should look not just at written documents and written records, but they also need to look at the unrecorded past, the visual past, such as material culture, which for him meant farming implements and the way houses had been constructed and the way fields were fenced. It also means looking at things like folklore, the stories and the oral traditions that are told within a particular community. And what comes through, I think, when you read his work for the first time, is his love for the landscape. He loves walking, being outside, actually immersing himself in the places. And it comes across as well his firm conviction, which he repeats over and over, which is that if you are to understand a locality or a place, you must see it for yourself. You must go there and understand in order to understand what it's like. And no doubt, because of Evan's influence, Irish local history has been quite strongly represented amongst geographers. And much of the really amazing local history that we do have has actually been produced by individuals who really call themselves geographers first and historians second. I think in particular Willie Nolan, who many of you, of his work, I'm sure you've come across. But I'd also like to point to a third influence on Irish local history, which has kind of brought it into this new type of local history. And that was the growing influence in social history, the history from below, of the 1960s and 70s. Because in the 1960s and 70s, while the youngsters were having sit-ins and love-ins and thinking about peace and love, a bunch of his Marxist historians in Oxford were thinking about local history. Because a group of Marxist historians at Ruskin College in Oxford, which was an adult education college, began to argue that really history shouldn't be about the powerful, the strong, and the elites. It should be about ordinary people. And this was really the start of what became known as history from below. And this became hugely influential, and it opened up whole new areas of research that no one had ever really even thought before. And this was really the start of a whole discipline of history called social and economic history. Really, the study of social and economic interactions in the past. It led to a whole series of new research projects into things like the working classes, who had never been studied before, the poor, industrialization, the processes of mechanization, the idea of business and commerce, finance, and the law. It worked its way into projects into art and culture, into families and communities. It eventually worked its way into women's history, into popular belief and attitudes. So a whole different approach then to thinking about the study of churches and religion as well. So it was really a very important and significant movement. And I think it's easy to see how social and economic history might promote and stimulate an interest in your local area. Because if you become interested in the poor, why not study the poor in your local area or find out what their experience had been? And it's also easy to see, I think, hopefully, that it's very much the influence which I have adopted and which Alwyn and Barry and I have used for the structure of these lectures. Because our topics that we have chosen for this study of local history really reflect more of a social and economic approach to local history than they do to, say, the geographical, when we might have focused instead on, say, population or land ownership or farming. And these could have easily been topics in their own right. So maybe if these go well and you all keep coming and find them really interesting, we'll do them again next year and have with a whole new series of themes.